Our story starts in 1865 with Thomas Bard, a young man of promise who had served as a Union scout in the Civil War. He left Pennsylvania and arrived in California as a land agent. Bard's employer, Thomas Scott, was the Assistant Secretary of War under President Lincoln, as well as Vice President of the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, which was the largest corporation in the world at the time. A man of great wealth, Thomas Scott acquired land in California, including a large portion of a 44,000-acre Mexican land grant known as Rancho El Rio de Santa Clara o La Colonia, one of 17 ranchos in Ventura County. A true American industrialist, Scott sent young Bard to look for oil in this barren land out west. Thomas Bard was responsible for drilling the first free-flowing oil well in California. But oil drilling in Ventura County was not as profitable as expected, so young Bard was given the task of portioning off and selling Rancho La Colonia, which would later become Oxnard and Port Hueneme. Bard realized that the fertile soil combined with the temperate climate was perfect for farming, and having a local wharf to ship out crops to world markets would make the land even more valuable to the immigrant farmers who were settling here. When Bard arrived in the little village of Hueneme, he discovered that there was a 1,000-foot deep submarine canyon off the coast that provided the ideal location for a wharf. In fact, for hundreds of years, the native Chumash used this location to rest during their journeys along the coast with their canoes or tomals because of its safe harbor conditions. A wharf here would serve the growing agricultural community as well as the new oil industry. Thomas Bard's vision was born. Before Bard's dream of a wharf could be realized, a land dispute intervened with his plans. A group of 100 squatters had settled on the land near the deep water canyon on the very site of the proposed wharf, claiming that there was an error in the land survey, so this area was not part of the original Rancho La Colonia purchased by Mr. Scott. This dispute became known as the Hueneme War. Among the squatters were the Clanton family, who had been in trouble with the law before and had a reputation for murder and cattle rustling. Some years later, Ike and Billy Clanton would be infamous for the shootout at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona. Luckily, Thomas Bard was no stranger to face-to-face combat. What ensued were fistfights, knockdowns, and a makeshift gallows called for by the squatters to hang Bard on the spot. However, Bard's reinforcements arrived and stood shoulder to shoulder, rifles aimed at the would-be hangmen's heads, and the Hueneme War came to an end in a gentleman's agreement, without a single gunshot. The land title was eventually settled in Bard's favor, and the wharf was completed. In September 1871, the Los Angeles Star called it a magnificent wharf, 1,200 feet long, built right through the surf. Thomas Bard laid out the plans for the town and changed the spelling of the name back to the Spanish version, Hueneme, spelled with an H and U to make the W sound. The wharf brought life to the sleepy village of Hueneme, as it was still called. Farm carts filled the dusty streets of the little town on their way to the wharf, and houses, hotels, and businesses sprung up along Main Street and Market Street. Farm carts loaded with grains, lima beans, wool, and livestock lined up for hours, waiting for crops to be weighed and shipped. Some came from as far away as the Conejo Valley, which is Thousand Oaks today, a 2-day journey. Ventura County became known as the lima bean capital of the world, all shipped out of Bard's Wharf. In 1895, the wharf was extended to 1,500 feet, now capable of accommodating larger, deeper draft vessels. Notice the lumber piled up, which was delivered to the wharf to accommodate the growing community. This watercolor by William Gilkerson shows Bard's Wharf in its heyday in the 1890s. It is on display at the Channel Islands Maritime Museum. If you look carefully, you can see the lumber coming in and the lima bean sacks ready to ship out. The town expanded due to the busy seaport. Thomas Bard became a prominent citizen of Ventura County and was the president of the Union Oil Company. He laid a 20-mile pipeline from Santa Paula to Hueneme. Bard's Wharf was the leading oil port on the California coast at the time. When lima beans lost their luster for some of the farmers, they discovered sugar beets, so they contracted with the Oxnard brothers to build the sugar beet factory nearby. Thomas Bard campaigned desperately to have the factory built in Hueneme, near the wharf. But when the Oxnards decided on a location in the middle of the beet fields, just 4 miles north of the wharf, the fate of Bard's Wharf was changed forever. The sugar beet factory brought electricity and a new railroad spur directly to Oxnard, so some of the farmers began to use the railroad now to ship their crops. Both the town of Hueneme and Bard's Wharf were bypassed. Thus, the wharf became a victim of progress. Agricultural broker and later banker Achille Levy originally shipped crops from Bard's Wharf, but now he found it more profitable to ship lima beans by railroad. The Santa Susana Tunnel was completed, which connected San Francisco to Los Angeles via Oxnard, once again bypassing Hueneme. Hueneme became a ghost town as buildings and businesses were moved to accommodate the population boom in Oxnard. At harvest time, there were very few carts and wagons making their way to the wharf now. Although the town was deserted, the beach was still used for camping. Thomas Bard became Senator Bard, the first Ventura County U.S. Senator, and sold his now deserted wharf to a developer who had big plans to create a seaside resort called Hueneme Beach. But the plan fell through. In 1910, the Farmers Warehouse Company purchased the wharf, and in 1912, the wharf collapsed, washing away 700 feet of its construction, finalizing the fate of the once active wharf. By the 1920s, the dilapidated wharf was only occasionally used by fishermen. The town dwindled down to about 300 people. But on the weekends, Hueneme Beach
Trolley
was still
cars
popular. Traveled down A Street to transport people from Oxnard to the beach. The one-way fare was 20 cents, and it took 15 minutes. In the meantime, young Richard Bard had returned home from World War I to take over the family business, since his father had passed away. He obtained 20% of the Farmers Warehouse Company, which owned the decaying wharf that his father had built about 50 years earlier. The Sunkist Lemon Company was growing and opened 2 new packing plants in Hueneme. Sunkist was the largest employer in Hueneme during the 1920s and 30s. Bard also noticed that the oil industry was on the rise in Ventura County. He recognized the need for a deep water harbor to support the increasing citrus and oil industries in Ventura County, and he began a 14-year campaign to fulfill his father's vision and his own dream. In 1926, Richard Bard set the political gears in motion, which led to the passing of a federal bill that initiated a Ventura County harbor at Hueneme. This was the beginning of a bitter battle that lasted 4 years between the city of Ventura and Hueneme supporters over the best location for the port. Bard was publicly attacked and accused of profiteering and manipulating survey reports by anti-Hueneme propaganda. There was even a call to remove Bard from his position as County Harbor Commissioner, but Richard Bard did not back down. By this time, he had invested $350,000 of his own money on surveys, land purchases, fees, reports, and legal expenses to prove that Hueneme was the better location for the county-owned harbor. Ventura or Hueneme? That was the question. As you can see from this list, the points stack up on the Hueneme side, with the bottom line being that to create a harbor in Ventura would be double the cost of Hueneme. But still, the battle raged between the Hueneme supporters and the city of Ventura. Attempts at public humiliation and accusations against Bard continued, with a take-no-prisoners intensity. Finally, in 1929, the Independent Committee approved Hueneme as the best site for the county port and called for a bond election of $2 million. But the city of Ventura still opposed the project. A suit was filed which went to the state Supreme Court, and in 1931, the act that had created the Ventura County Harbor District was declared unconstitutional, defeating Bard's plan for a county harbor. Undaunted by continued efforts to thwart the realization of the vision, Bard developed a new plan for a privately owned harbor and formed a new company, the Hueneme Dock Corporation. He applied for a loan with President FDR's Public Works Administration for $1,600,000, which seemed like the perfect solution for the community project. In 1934, he received a telegram stating the loan was approved. But once again, opposition from the anti-Hueneme group rose, this time reaching as far as Washington, D.C. Getting wind of this, Bard presented himself in the Capitol and met with PWA Administrator Harold Ickes, who accused Bard of creating the project for his own personal gain. In 1935, the PWA rescinded the loan. By this time, Bard had spent about $500,000 of his own family funds on the project. Never at a loss for new solutions, Richard Bard tried to make a deal with the city of Ventura. He offered 247 acres of land and all the rights of way if the city would build the harbor at Hueneme. After their refusal, he turned to the city of Oxnard, who readily accepted. Thus, the Oxnard Harbor District was formed, encompassing Hueneme, Oxnard, Camarillo, Somis, Newbury Park, and Thousand Oaks. Another application was sent to PWA for a grant of $783,000. Both the telegram and newspaper headlines announced the approval of federal funds. But, once again, the federal government turned down public funding for a harbor at Hueneme. In a last-ditch attempt to raise the funds, the Harbor District called for a special election for a bond issue of $1,750,000, which was fully subscribed by 1939. The port of Hueneme would be the first harbor in American history to be constructed without 1 cent of federal money. At the groundbreaking ceremony, Richard Bard was hailed as the father of Port Hueneme before a cheering crowd. In his speech that day, he said,
"Looking back on 14 years of ups and downs, mostly downs, in our effort to establish a harbor at this locality, it seems almost unbelievable that it's now an actuality."
Dredging started in 1939. While the nation was still in the grip of the Great Depression, the Harbor of Dreams, funded by the residents of the community, was constructed. The next year, the port was completed and opened on July 6, 1940. Opening day was a gala celebration, and the little town of Hueneme awoke from its deep sleep, changing its name to reflect its new status to Port Hueneme. The Harbor District received a telegram from President Roosevelt on opening day.
"Hearty congratulations to the community of Oxnard on the fine enterprise which has prompted them out of their own financial resources to create the new harbor at Port Hueneme."
But the ups and downs that were destined to be a part of the story of Port Hueneme were not over. On the same day as the opening celebration, the port was closed due to a labor dispute with the longshoremen's union. The dispute was settled, and the port got off to a slow but steady start. That same year, the port was selected by the U.S. Maritime Service as the site for a new training vessel that would inhabit Dock 1. The ship, American Sailor, came to port in August 1941. Just 4 months later, Pearl Harbor was bombed, and once again, the path of the port's destiny took a turn in another direction. 1942 opened with fear and blackouts along the coast of California after the sinking of the Union Oil tanker in local waters. The Coast Guard was on alert, and tension was intense. In an ironic turn of events, the U.S. Navy took over the port that the federal government had repeatedly refused to fund in its development. The district offered a lease to the Navy, but Uncle Sam took ownership of the entire port by paying off the bond indebtedness. The CB base at the port made a tremendous contribution to the war effort, moving more than 7.5 million tons of war material, utilizing over 1,000 ships and employing 12,000 people. Port Hueneme shipped 25% of all war supplies to the Pacific. At the end of the war, thousands of returning servicemen and women came home through the naval base at the port of Hueneme. With the war over, the Harbor Commission began negotiations to lease back a portion of the port for commercial use. In 1948, the Harbor District acquired use of Dock 1, serving the fishing and construction industries and general cargo. In the picture at the right, notice the lumber being lifted, reminiscent of the early days of Bard's Wharf. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, port operations were expanded. To this day, the Port of Hueneme continues to enjoy a joint partnership with the U.S. Navy and the Harbor District, serving both government and commercial interests. In the 1960s and the early 70s, the largest port customer was the offshore oil industry, shipping equipment and supplies out to the oil platforms in the Santa Barbara Channel. This was Thomas Bard's original plan in the 1870s, which was brought back to life by his son Richard 50 years later, and finally realized 100 years later. In 1977, the first imported cars arrived. Notice the method of transporting the auto from the ship to the dock. Since then, more than 4 million autos have transited the port. The 1970s also saw the beginning of the fresh fruit import and export operations with the Del Monte Tropical Fruit Company. From 1985 to 2003, the port was continually expanded to support the growing import and export operations and was designated as an international port of entry. Today, the Port of Hueneme is one of the busiest banana gateways in the country, importing more than 600,000 metric tons per year. The port ranks among the top 10 U.S. ports for the import and export of automobiles, handling over 270,000 autos a year. The Port of Hueneme has come a long way from Bard's Wharf, built to ship out crops grown by local farmers almost a century and a half ago. Port operations today surely have surpassed the dreams of both Thomas and Richard Bard. They would be proud of their legacy to the community if they were here today. Please be sure to explore the new Port of Hueneme exhibit on the upper deck of the Channel Islands Maritime Museum to find out more about the operations of the port today.